What is the FLD? FLD is, of course, an acronym for Future Line of Demarcation. This is a tool that J.M. Hurst first published information about in 1967. He mentioned the FLD in his Profit Magic of Stock Transaction Timing book. He then went into further details in the Cycles course that he published in the 1970s. So in this video, I'm going to introduce what the FLD really is, both in terms of its definition, but also what it means to us in terms of trading it. This is going to be a bit of a dry video. I'm going to warn you, it's a little technical. And I know that you're eager to skip ahead to the exciting bits where we're going to look at charts and we're going to start trading. But I would encourage you to understand this material because this is what underlies the sentient FLD indicator. And if you do not really understand it, I think that you're not going to make as much as you might otherwise out of trading the sentient FLD indicator. So let's get stuck into it. This is a chart of sorts. As you can see, it is a very simple Excel spreadsheet. And this is a sine curve. Now, a sine curve is used to represent the cycles that are influencing the financial markets that we are trading. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. There is going to be more discussion about Hurst cycles generally later on in this series of tutorial videos. But the important thing is that, of course, Hurst discovered that financial markets, the price movements of financial markets, are influenced by multiple cycles. There are many, many cycles, in fact, an infinite number of cycles that influence the markets that we trade. And each one of these cycles can be visualized as a sine curve. So this is how we speak about these cycles. Here is, of course, a peak to the cycle, and here is a trough. So a trough is a low point and a peak is a high point. I think that's fairly obvious, but it does bear mentioning. Here is the initial trough of this cycle. And so this cycle is an influence to the price movement. You're probably asking yourself, what is a cycle? And we're not going to go down that road in this video. It makes for a fascinating discussion, but we're not going to go there today because that turns out to be a very complex discussion. And the truth is, we don't really know what these cycles are. The important thing is that Hurst demonstrated 50 years ago that he found mathematical evidence of these cycles in price movements. And that is all that we need to understand for now. So when a cycle is moving up, as you can see from this trough up to this peak, it is influencing prices to rise. When the cycle is falling, it is influencing prices to fall. And the important thing about the cycle is that by definition, this happens with a certain degree of regularity. A cycle has a wavelength, which can be measured as the distance between two troughs. It could also be measured as the distance between two peaks, or in fact as the distance between any two points in the movement of the cycle that are in phase with each other. That is the wavelength of the cycle. And of course, when it comes to financial markets, we measure the wavelength in terms of time. So a wavelength of a cycle could be 20 days, 10 days. It could be as short as 3 minutes. The next thing to understand about the cycle is that it has an amplitude. That is the force with which it influences prices to rise and then, of course, to fall. That is described as the amplitude of the cycle. And so a sine wave makes for a good representation of the way in which a cycle influences price. Now, you might look at that and say it doesn't look very much like the financial markets that I'm trading. Of course it doesn't. That's because there is only one cycle. There is also an interesting relationship between cycles and price, which we're going to delve into a little bit later on. But for now, you should understand that we are looking at one cycle, which is influencing price. We're going to add some more cycles in a moment. So what is the FLD? Here we have plotted a dotted line. It is purple in color, and this dotted line is effectively the FLD for this blue cycle. It is in fact a very simple line, as I think you can see. It is simply this cycle displaced to the right on the chart by half the wavelength. So again, we measure the wavelength from trough to trough. There we go. We get half of it, and we replot this cycle to the right by half the wavelength, and therefore we get an echo, if you like, of the cycle, which is beating with the same wavelength, simply displaced to the right. Now, this is how Hurst defined the FLD, and he pointed out several features which are still important to us to this day. The first thing that he pointed out is that when price, or at least this blue line, which we're calling price for now, when price crosses above the FLD, as you can see it does over here, that confirms that a trough of the cycle upon which the FLD is based has formed in the market. That's a little complex. I'm not going to dwell on it because it's not really very important to you working with the FLD indicator. As price crosses down below the FLD, that also confirms that a peak of the cycle upon which the FLD is based has formed in the market. Now, that information is analysis information, if you like. And interestingly, the sentient FLD indicator does use this information to inform its analysis. You don't even need to know about it because it is doing it behind the scenes. The next thing that Hurst defined, a very useful thing and something that we definitely use to this day, is he pointed out that when price crosses above the FLD, we can then generate a target to the upside if price crosses above the FLD by measuring a distance from the price trough, or the low point of the cycle, up to the point at which the FLD is crossed, which is that amount over there. We can extend it an equal distance into the future in terms of time and in terms of price, and we will arrive at a target for the next peak. Now, bear in mind that this FLD is simply this cycle displaced to the right. And so let's consider what we would be seeing at the time that price crosses the FLD. At this moment, we do not have any of this price action. We have not seen this price action yet. But are we seeing this FLD? Yes, we are, and the reason that we are seeing this FLD is because the FLD is the cycle action displaced by half of the wavelength, meaning that at the time that price actually interacts or crosses that FLD, the dotted pink line at this point, we are seeing the FLD. We're not seeing this part of the FLD, but we are seeing the FLD all the way up to this point over here. And so as price crosses the FLD, we can then generate a target. This ability to be able to calculate the target for a move was pointed out by Hurst, or discovered or defined by Hurst 50 years ago. And that is at the core of what the sentient FLD indicator does for us in terms of calculating the targets to these moves. Moves can be calculated when price crosses above the FLD and also when price crosses below the FLD. As it does over here, we can simply generate a target to the downside. So this is the theory as to why the FLD works on the basis of a single cycle. There was, just for the sake of completeness, another feature of the FLD that Hurst pointed out, which is that when the FLD is experiencing a trough, generally speaking, the cycle will be experiencing a peak. And when the FLD is experiencing a peak, the cycle will be experiencing a trough. Because the FLD is projected into the future, we can anticipate using the FLD to some extent when the cycle itself is going to experience troughs and peaks. The interesting thing about this feature of the FLD is it is not quite as reliable as the other aspects of the FLD, and so it's not something that we often speak about, but it does often provide a useful clue as to when to expect peaks and troughs. But now that's all very well. We have one cycle and that cycle's FLD, and it looks perfect. It's of course an ideal situation. However, we know that the markets are not influenced by only one cycle at a time. They are influenced by multiple cycles. So what happens when we combine more than one cycle? Here is a diagram that shows how Hurst suggested that cycles combine. Here we have a grey cycle, and here we have an orange cycle. These two cycles are combined using Hurst's principle of summation simply by adding up the cycle influence, resulting in this blue line over here. Now, I should point out that these cycles are correctly related in terms of their wavelengths. They are not perfectly correctly related in terms of their amplitudes, but I'm not going to dwell on that now because that's not really the kind of information that you need to know now. But you should be aware that in the markets, the cycles experience greater variation in their amplitudes than they do in their wavelengths. Nevertheless, this blue line over here is the result of combining these two cycles according to the principles that Hurst defined in terms of how the cycles influence financial markets. So let's get rid of the individual cycles. Here is a chart, if you like, of two cycles that are causing price to rise and then to fall, rise and then fall again. Notice the fact that the combination of two cycles results in an M shape. That's fairly important for our consideration of these cycles, but it's not something we need to dwell on at the moment. What happens when we apply the FLD of one of the cycles to this combination of two cycles? This is what happens. Now you will notice that we still have price crossing this FLD over here, and in fact we can still generate a target. But do you notice that that target is exceeded? Price actually goes further than that target would suggest. That is not exactly what Hurst defined when he was describing the targets generated by the FLD. So why is that? Why is that target exceeded? Of course, it is influenced by the impetus of the second cycle. What about where price crosses down below the FLD over here? When it does so, you will notice that the target that is generated should be down here. But in fact, price only reaches that far. It fails to reach the target, both as a matter of interest in terms of price. It hasn't reached as far down as it should have, and also in terms of time, because the time target calculated by this price line crossing this FLD would have been over here, but in fact the trough came in early, and so we have an example of price not achieving its target and turning around early, both in terms of price and time. Here we have another target, and that target is off the top of the chart over here, and again we find a target that is not achieved in terms of price or time. Our final target on this chart is where price crosses down below the FLD. Here we see an example of the target being fulfilled or reached by price and exceeded. Why is it exceeded? It is, of course, exceeded because of the fact that we are combining two cycles, and both of them at that time are influencing the price movement to move down, thereby exceeding the target, both in terms of price and time. Now, I don't want you to be taking notes and getting terribly detailed about where the targets are exceeded and where they aren't. We are going to get to that point, but you don't need to start doing it yet because we are going to make this even more complicated. The markets consist of many more than two cycles. So let's add a third cycle into the mix. Here is a third cycle. I'm staying with just the two waves of the shorter cycle at the moment, and you can see the influence of the third cycle because of the fact that, of course, this trough over here is at a higher level than the trough at which the combination of the three cycles starts. Notice how the addition of the third cycle is again affecting our targets. This target over here is exceeded. In fact, it's exceeded by a greater percentage than it was exceeded when there were only two cycles being considered. This target over here is again not met to the downside. Price turns around very quickly after it crosses below the FLD, and so it fails to meet that target both in terms of price and time. This target over here, as a matter of interest, is now fulfilled, and it is indeed exceeded. The reason for that, of course, is our new cycle that we have added. And here the move down provides us with a target over here, which is met by price and also exceeded. So again, by adding extra cycles, we still have our targets on this chart, but the targets are either exceeded or price fails to meet them. And the reason for that is because of the combination of the influence of the cycles. Now, at this scale, we are of course only seeing half of the third cycle that we've added. So let's take a step back. Let's zoom out on the same combination of these cycles. This is what we were looking at previously. There is our M shape, and now we have simply added the next M shape to include the full third cycle that we have added to the mix. And in fact, we have added a longer term trend to this chart, as you can see, because there is a slow rising influence, which could of course be a fourth cycle or the combination of many longer cycles. Now, what happens when we add our FLD to this cycle shape? There is the FLD. And this is where you should start paying attention to the way in which price interacts with the FLD. Because here we have the full sequence that we speak about when trading the FLD. Before I run through the sequence with you, I would like to explain to you how I discovered this. The combination of multiple cycles and the way in which they interact with the FLD is not in fact something Hurst ever spoke about. It's something I discovered when I started trading with Hurst cycles. I was very enthusiastic about the FLD, and I would witness price crossing an FLD, such as it did over here. I would calculate my target. I would enter into my long trade to capture this price rise, and I would succeed in making a profitable trade because price rushed up, achieved its target, and even went a little bit further, at which point I would take my profits. Feeling enthusiastic about the FLD, I would then experience the price coming down to the FLD. It would then do something strange. It would touch the FLD. Sometimes I would jump into a trade because of the slight margin of error that we experience in price action in terms of interacting with the FLD. I would sometimes jump into a short trade, thinking here price has crossed down below the FLD and I'm going to benefit from my short trade. I would be very disappointed, however, because price, as you can see, did not move down at all, but instead immediately turned against me. I would then make a losing trade, probably getting out at this point over here, a little bit above the previous peak. Feeling a little wary about this, I would enter into another trade over here, which would turn out to be a profitable trade. I might keep going and trade here, taking another profitable trade. By now, I have made 3 winning trades out of 4. I'm feeling quite positive about this. At this point, therefore, I load lots of money onto a short trade here with my target down here. Price, of course, fails to reach down to the target, turns back around again, and crosses above the point at which I entered the trade, resulting in a losing trade. At this point, I've had 3 winning trades and 2 losing trades. I still believe in the FLD. Price crosses above the FLD over here. I jump into a long trade, probably load a little too much money into that trade, thinking that this has got to be the one that's going to work. Here is my target. What does price do? It significantly fails to reach the target, and I end up with another losing trade. By the time price crosses down below this FLD, I have probably stopped trading. I might jump into a short trade, incorrectly calculating a target over here. As soon as price reaches the target, I pull out of my trade and miss the rest of this move. Of course, missing a move is not really a problem, but most likely by the time we reach this point of the cycle, I have given up on trading the FLD. Because I have had 3 profitable trades and 3 losing trades, and I'm beginning to think there is nothing to this. That is what happened to me and my trading when I started working with the FLD. But these winning trades enticed me to investigate the FLD in more detail. And that is when I noticed that there was in fact a rhythm to the trades that I was making. I would make profitable trades and losing trades not completely arbitrarily, but according to a rhythm which matched the rhythm of these cycles. And that is when I started to study the idea of the FLD when compared to prices influenced by more than one cycle, which was where Hurst had stopped in his explanation of the way in which the FLD works. And that is when I discovered the sequence. So let's speak about this sequence. First of all, we have a sequence that plays out over a combination of 3 cycles. We have a long cycle, and I will mark the troughs of that long cycle with these blue diamonds. The first trough of the long cycle is right over here at the beginning of our price data, and the final trough of our long cycle is over here at the end of our data. We then have a shorter cycle, which has a trough right at the beginning over here, and it has another trough over here in the middle, and it has its final trough over here. Then we have our shortest cycle, which has a trough over here. It has a trough over here. Of course, it has a synchronous trough with the black cycle. It has a trough here, and of course, another synchronous trough over here. You can see the pink cycle troughs here in the data. Now, let's consider the FLD that is based, of course, upon this pink cycle. Let's consider the sequence of interactions that occur. The first interaction that occurs is this one here, where price crosses up above the FLD. We label this with the letter A. The A category interaction. And note that I use the word interaction. We will also be speaking about the A category trade, which is a trade that we can make on the basis of the interaction between price and the FLD, which we label the A category interaction. Many people also speak about the A wave as the move that follows the A category interaction. I use the word interaction because, of course, the A wave is a term that is used by Elliott wave analysts, and I try to avoid confusion by referring to these interactions as interactions because that is what they are, where price interacts with the FLD. And so that is our first interaction, an A category interaction, which provides us with a good long trading opportunity where price is expected to reach the target generated on the basis of price crossing over the FLD and indeed exceed it, which is exactly, as you can see, what happens here. The next time that price interacts with the FLD is where it comes down to the FLD and touches it over here. Now, whether it touches it or drops slightly below the FLD or in fact fails to reach the FLD is a result of the amplitude relationship between these different cycles. I do not want to get too complicated about it here, but what we see in this particular diagram is the ideal situation, where price comes down and it finds support exactly at the level of the FLD. That is when the relationship between the amplitudes of these cycles has a particular mathematical value, but we're not going to dwell on it here. It is important to note that price will not always exactly touch that FLD. Sometimes it will drop a little below it, sometimes it will fail to actually reach it. And because of this, the interaction which we see here as a single interaction where price finds support is in fact labeled with 2 letters. The letter B, which is where price comes down and touches or maybe just drops below the FLD, and then the letter C as price pulls back up and away from the FLD, or if it has dropped below the FLD, crosses back above it. This interaction pair is labeled as a pair, unless of course price does drop down below the FLD, in which case that interaction is labeled a B category interaction, and then the C category interaction is where price pulls up away from it. But for now, we're going to focus on this as being an interaction pair, a BC category interaction pair. The important thing is the price effectively finds support at the level of the FLD when the BC category interaction is occurring. The other important thing to note is that this interaction occurs when the first trough of this pink cycle forms in the market. The next interaction between price and the FLD is this interaction here, where price crosses down below the FLD, and we label that a D category interaction. A D category interaction usually provides us with a fairly good short trading opportunity. However, you should note that the D category short trading opportunity is one that you need to stay on top of. You need to stay on your toes, be aware that the market is likely to turn around very quickly and reverse direction because of the fact that the D category interaction results in a price move where price is coming down into this fairly big cycle trough. I say fairly big, it's only 1 degree greater in magnitude than the pink cycle, the FLD of which we are trading, but that is the short trading opportunity that the D category interaction provides us with. The next interaction is labeled, very imaginatively, the E category interaction, where price crosses up back above the FLD. Now, similar to the D category interaction, which results in a short trade that we need to stay on top of because of the fact that it will reverse quickly, the E category interaction provides us with a long trading opportunity, and again we need to stay on top of it because this is the second peak of the cycle, and this is the point at which all the cycles that we are considering are turning down, and so again we need to set some tight stops. We need to be ready to get out of this long trade fairly quickly because things can turn nasty. The next interaction is of course the F category interaction. Now, the F category interaction provides us with a good short trading opportunity. Although in this idealized diagram we see price only coming down to this point over here, in reality, because our two longer cycles have turned down, the way in which financial markets work is that they will often move down fairly rapidly. You probably know that markets tend to move down quicker than they move up. And so for that reason, catching this F category short trading opportunity is usually a profitable thing to do. That is because the next interactions are these G and H category interactions. Now, similar to the BC category interaction pair, the GH category interactions are also a pair. Very often we will see price find resistance at the level of the FLD at the GH category interaction pair. Here you can see, as does sometimes happen in the markets, that the G and H category interactions have been split. They are separated because price does in fact cross above the FLD over here. That is not a long trade that you want to take because, as you can see, price immediately collapses and crosses back down below the FLD. And because of the nature of the markets moving down faster than they move up, we will often find that our F category short trade, we will actually stay in that short trade and carry that trade all the way down to the next cycle trough. That is the full sequence of A to H interactions that occur between price and the FLD of a cycle. You might ask yourself, what about adding in the longer cycles? The good news is we don't really need to worry about it because of the relationship between the wavelengths of these cycles, considering only 3 cycles that produce this A to H sequence of interactions is adequate for us to make consistent trading decisions. We will be spending more time, obviously, speaking about this sequence of interactions and how we trade it. But let me very quickly for you now highlight the obvious trades that we make on the basis of this sequence of interactions. Our first trading opportunity is this long A category trading opportunity when price crosses above the FLD following a trough of the longest cycle that we are considering. The BC category interaction pair does not provide us with a short trading opportunity, but it does provide us with another long trading opportunity. That is a particularly powerful and useful trading opportunity, particularly if we have seen an A category trade that exceeded its target, and then we witness price finding support at the level of the FLD. We know that we are in for a profitable C category trade following the BC category interaction pair. The D category interaction provides us with a short trading opportunity, which, as I've mentioned, we need to be a little sharp about in terms of getting out of it because of the fact the price is about to turn around quickly. The E category interaction provides us with another long trading opportunity. Again, that is usually a good trading opportunity, but we do need to stay on our toes and get out of that trade fairly quickly as the market turns down after forming the second peak. Finally, our F category interaction provides us with a good short trading opportunity, often one that, as a matter of interest, we stay in all the way down to the trough, but we do have another opportunity for getting into this short trade provided to us by the GH category interaction pair if we witness price finding resistance at the level of the FLD, thereby increasing our confidence that price must still move down and form this trough. Now, will you be making all of these trades? Are you going to become a trading demon and be catching every single one of these trades for every single sequence of these 3 cycles? Probably not. You might, but it's very unlikely that you will. So these are the trades that we are going to be focusing on. Certainly the A category trade is a very good trading opportunity. However, it is a slightly dangerous trading opportunity, as we will discuss, because it does rely on the correct identification of this cycle trough. The C category trade, which is this one over here, as price rises up, having found support at the level of the FLD, is a much safer trade, and that is likely to be a trade that you're going to be looking out for as often as possible. The D and E category trades, by their nature, are a little tricky, so you might well skip those, and finally you will want to catch the downward move. That is assuming, of course, that the underlying trend, in other words, the combination of the longer cycles, indicates that a short trade is going to work in your favor, in which case you will certainly be looking to catch the F category trade, which often matches the A category trade in terms of its profitability and the opportunities that it presents. Again, if you miss the F category trade, you might well catch an H category trade if price finds resistance at the level of the FLD, but that trade too carries some risks, in particular the possibility that the big cycle trough you think you are heading into has in fact already occurred. So that is our sequence of interactions and a brief overview of the trading opportunities that those interactions present us with. But now this is one FLD on the chart. I have used a purple color to roughly match the coloring in the sentient FLD indicator, because this is of course our signal cycle. So why does the sentient FLD indicator show 3 FLDs on each chart? The reason that it does that is because there is, of course, a sequence that plays out for each and every FLD, for each and every cycle, and the combination of the 3 FLDs is particularly powerful. So let's add some more FLDs onto this chart. Here is a roughly orange colored cycle. This is our mid cycle. As you can see, it is based on a longer cycle wavelength because of the fact that it is displaced. It is in fact displaced by double the amount that the purple cycle was displaced, as you can see over here. Now there is a sequence of interactions that plays out between price and this FLD as well. It is, luckily, exactly the same sequence of interactions, and so this first interaction, where price crosses up above the FLD, is indeed labeled the A category interaction, and that provides us with a long trading opportunity. Notice, however, that in this case the A category trading opportunity does not result in a trade that reaches its target. And that is because this is the mid-cycle. We need to be considering additional cycles if we're going to be trading the mid-cycle. That is why we call this purple cycle the signal cycle. That is the cycle that we're using to take our trading opportunities. We can certainly trade the interactions with the mid-cycle or the orange-colored cycle, but you must bear in mind that they are not exactly the same opportunities as we get for the signal cycle. As a matter of interest, of course, the mid-cycle experiences a trough over here. That is the first trough of the mid-cycle, following this trough over here at the beginning of our chart. Notice too that here is our BC category interaction pair. where price finds approximate support at the level of that orange FLD. But notice how this support is spread out over many more bars. That's because this is a longer cycle. Here is the D category interaction as price crosses down below the orange cycle FLD. The important thing to bear in mind is that the sequence is the same, but with the longer cycles, any cycle that is not your signal cycle for a particular time frame, you need to give the FLD a little bit of room to breathe, and you need to handle trading this cycle FLD differently to the way in which you handle the trading of the signal cycle FLD. Now, what about our third FLD? In order to consider our third FLD, we're going to zoom out again so that we have a little more room to consider the interaction between price and each one of these FLDs. So previously we were looking at this section of price movement, or the combination of these cycles, which we are using as our simulated price movement. So all we've done is we've taken a step back. We are now looking at double the amount of time. This is effectively the combination of 4 cycles plus, of course, a longer term trend. So let's add our FLD onto this price movement. There it is, and again we can identify our sequence of interactions. Here we have our A category interaction, our BC pair is over here, our D category interaction, our E category interaction, here is our F, and here is our G, and then our H, which again are separated in this example, but they are often experienced as a pair. What happens then is we simply repeat the entire sequence. Here is our A, here is our BC. Notice the slight differences between this BC and that BC. Here, as you can see, price actually gets down below the FLD. Why is that? It's because of the different phasing of the longer cycles, and that's something very important to remember as you are trading. Here is our next D category interaction, our E category, and then our F category. And here we have our GH category interaction pair. Notice here again the difference. The GH category pair is providing resistance, or at least the FLD is providing resistance to price, just as we experienced price providing support over here for this BC category interaction. Those subtle differences in the way in which these interactions form are the result of the longer cycles that are being added to the mix. Bear in mind that we have an infinite number of cycles, and so the variations in this sequence can be fairly extensive. However, we are always able to identify the sequence that is playing out on our charts. Luckily, we have the sentient FLD indicator to do that for us. Now let's add our second FLD line. Here is the orange line, or the mid-cycle line. Let me label the interactions here using a different color. So here we have our A category interaction. Here we have our BC category interaction pair. Notice how price finds support at the level of that FLD. There it is. Let me draw a circle around it. It's finding support at the level of that FLD. And of course, this is where the trough of that orange cycle or mid-cycle is forming in the market. Our D category interaction is over here. Our E category interaction is over here. Our F category interaction is over here. And here is our GH category interaction pair. Again, a little more spread out than the interactions with the purple cycle or signal cycle. Now you will notice an interesting thing. There is, of course, a relationship between the interactions that are occurring between price and the signal cycle and price and the mid-cycle. For instance, we will get an A category interaction in the signal cycle and then an A category interaction in the mid-cycle. Then the BC category interaction pair for the signal cycle, then the D category interaction, and then the E category interaction, and in between the D and the E, we experience a BC category pair for the mid-cycle. I'm not going to speak through every one of these interactions. The important point is that, like two puzzle pieces fitting together, the interactions for both of these sequences interlock, if you like. As you start trading with the sentient FLD indicator, you're going to see this playing out time and time again on your charts. Now, what about the third cycle FLD? Let's add that. Here is our third cycle FLD, the green FLD. And again, we experience interactions between price and this FLD. In particular, here is our A category interaction. Notice how our A category interaction is happening on this idealized chart simultaneously with the BC category interaction with the signal cycle. That doesn't always happen, but you will find it happening on your charts. What about the BC category interaction with the green cycle? That is expected to occur at the time that the green cycle trough is forming in the market, and of course that trough is occurring over here. And notice the very long period of support that green FLD provides to price. It's very extended, as you can see, and that would be labeled our BC category interaction. Then, of course, we have our D category interaction that occurs over here as price crosses down below the green cycle FLD. Notice how on this idealized chart, the D category interaction for the green cycle is occurring at about the same time as the F category interaction occurs for our signal cycle. And this is occurring at about the same time that the G and H category interaction pairs are occurring for our orange cycle. I highlight this because it's an important thing to be able to identify these moments on your charts. Remember, the sentient FLD indicator is going to provide you with the symbols. It's going to provide the letters on your charts so that you can identify these moments. These are high quality moments where you have the sequence of A at the same time as a BC. That's a very good opportunity to climb into a long trade. Simultaneously, we get this DFGH combination over here, which is a good opportunity to enter into a short trade. Now let's step back again. Again, we have doubled our view. We've doubled the time scale that we're looking at here. The only FLD I've plotted on this chart is the green FLD, which is our sequence cycle. Remember, we have a signal cycle, then a mid cycle, and then the sequence cycle. The sequence cycle is the cycle over which the interaction sequence plays out between price and the signal cycle. So our green cycle is our sequence cycle. Here are the interactions with this longer period of time displayed. Our A category interaction as price crosses up above the green cycle FLD. Then our BC pair, which, as I pointed out on the other chart, is a very prolonged period of support. Then here is our D category interaction as price crosses down below the FLD. Our E category interaction as price crosses back above the FLD. Here is our F category interaction. And here is our G category interaction where price actually manages to get above the FLD and then eventually cross down below it in our H category interaction. That's meant to be a G over there. Okay, so that's our sequence of interactions. Now, the reason I'm showing you this chart is because I want to point out to you that these periods of support between B and C and the periods of resistance between G and H are very prolonged. For this reason, you do not trade the sequence cycle on your charts. It's important, in my opinion, for you to see the sequence cycle FLD, see where it is, and know what the next interaction is expected to be. But you would not make trading decisions on the basis of your sequence cycle on a chart. You might indeed trade your A category interaction, but you certainly would not be looking for trades for your BC category interactions. Again, D and E category trades you might take using your sequence cycle, but it is much better to switch to a longer time frame. Find the same cycle as a signal cycle on a longer time frame and trade the interactions on that time frame, rather than trading your sequence cycle on a shorter time frame. I hope that makes sense. The cycles that the sentient FLD presents on each one of your timeframes have been very carefully calculated to ensure that you are identifying the best opportunities for the signal cycle. The sequence cycle is very useful information for you, but you should not really be trading interaction with your green sequence cycle. What about our other two FLDs on this kind of timescale? There they are. What about the incredibly complex combinations of interactions? Actually, I'm going to stop you right there. What we have covered already in this sequence of videos about the FLD is all that you need to know. Those same sequences play out time and time again. This is a rabbit hole that you can get lost down in terms of identifying the multiple combinations of all of these FLDs and the interactions. But the good news is that we have actually covered everything, and those same sequences are going to keep playing out time and again on your charts. So take a deep breath, go pour yourself a cup of tea or a glass of wine or a beer or whatever you need. That is the theory of the FLD. How does that theory relate to real life? Let's take a look at a chart with the sentient FLD indicator on it. Here you can see the same three FLD lines that we've been looking at. Notice the same general M shapes that we can see in this price action. Notice also moments where price finds support at the level of FLDs and where price finds resistance at the level of those same FLDs. Everything that we have just spoken about in terms of the way in which the FLD works in an idealized world plays out in the real world. The sentient FLD indicator will identify the sequence of interactions for you. It will plot the FLDs on the chart for you. It will calculate your targets for you. Your task is to be able to interpret that information. Use your knowledge of the idealized sequence to effect profitable trades. Congratulations on making it this far. That's all the theory out of the way. In the next video, we're going to be working with the sentient FLD indicator. We're going to be focusing on how to get the indicator to display the information that you need to help you to make those profitable trading decisions.